Hi everyone, it's so nice to see you once again virtually. You're on season 4 of Music and Chat with Shueh-li Ong, and it's a good morning from me to you in Singapore. Please say hi in the live chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. Tell us if you're having breakfast, lunch, dinner, afternoon tea, whether it's a bright sunny day or it's raining or it's wintry. Perhaps it's fall where you are. Let us know, and don't forget to put the questions you may have for Chris, our guest today, in the live chat. Do it sooner than later because of the latency, and I will deal with them as the stream moves along. Music and Chat is indeed 2 years old. Yes, it is. And I'm grateful to you all for your support by subscribing to my channel. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And for being a part of our viewing audience. I shall continue to work for you diligently. Yes, I promise. And please help me pass the word around. Thank you. I want to say hello to a few of you. Roland Craig. Hey, thanks for joining us. Brian, nice to see you again. Wonderful. So I see most of you are in the US, and it's evening, obviously. It's night and day, as Chris and I were saying earlier on, and I'm wearing a visually suitable t-shirt. Night and day. Anyway, it is 9:33 a.m. in Singapore right now, and I don't want to waste too many precious minutes because I know we have tons of questions. If you may weigh questions, there'll be tons of them for our guest, Chris. I also want to say hi to Jeff Callum from San Francisco. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining us. So back to not wasting tons of minutes. I usually play a piece for you live from wherever I am, and I happen to be in my mom's apartment. Thank you, Mom. So I have with me plenty of my old gear, probably from school time or my first job type of gear. And I've had to beg and borrow, but I know it's time for an upgrade. So I had been using a Korg Triton. As you know, which I borrowed from my good friend Jeff Lowe. Jeff was also a guest on one of my live streams to talk about immersive audio. But as my regular viewers know, the pitch bend and modulation joystick had been giving me tons of problems. And I've done the cleaning stuff and all, and I still could not bring it to an absolute null point, 0 point. So I borrowed a K2000 from my good friend Mix, which we used to use for our work many years ago. I think the K2000 was in production between 1991 and year 2000, I think. I don't know, you might have to do a Google search. But the pitch bend wheel, as you can see, the keys are yellowed from age. The pitch bend wheel also requires some force to move, and when it springs back, it gives a clickety clack. Not sure if you can hear that. But nonetheless, it's always good to know that one can take any instrument and make good music out of it. Wheels or joysticks? If you ask me, they certainly introduce modulation, phrasing in differing ways. It's always fun to try something new. So without further ado, because I want to bring Chris Meyer in a few minutes, let me play you a movement from my upcoming album. It's called Microtunneling. I played it on several occasions, and it's one of my favorite pieces. It was put together post presentation I gave about expressive performance and so on and so forth, you know, my usual passion interests. And someone asked me if I'd ever composed microtonal music for the theremin, and it's very difficult not to write microtonal music for the theremin because it lends itself to it. But to keep it in tune, that's the hard part. So I jumped on that question, and I created Microtunneling. That's the name of the movement. So let me bring up the different cameras, and I'll do a quick calibration before I play for you. So this is Microtunneling. So that was microtunneling, everyone. Looks like you had some conversations about gear as I was playing. Wonderful. And I want to say hi to my good friend, our good friend, Gary Yelton as well. I will bring my Mac speakers down a bit, not my monitoring speakers down a bit, because I see Gary mentioning echo. Anyway, let's delay not. Oh, thank you, Jeff, for letting me know that it sounds good. Let's delay not, and let's bring our special guest, Chris Meyer, in. Let me bring up my Skype screen, and I shall proceed to call him. Here we go.
Hello.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for waiting patiently in the wings.
Oh, I was watching your performance. That was really good. I enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you so much. It's always thrilling to play live, because you know anything might happen. Life is good.
Life is good. Last week played my 6th live gig this year, so I know what you mean.
Well, we can't wait to watch a little clip from the video clip that you sent me. So we'll do that in a few minutes. But thanks for joining us today, and we want to talk more about how you got involved in doing modular synthesis, the methods and instruments that you use, and how they might have changed, which I'm sure they have. And also a little foray into the land of MIDI. So this interview, as you know, but for the sake of our viewers, will be in 2 parts. I call it 2 parts. The first will be questions that I have concerning the more meaningful aspects of instrument design / performance. Part 2, I'll hand over to you, the viewers, and your questions, because I know you have plenty. Also to Chris, who will kind of give us a little tour around his monster. He'll at least introduce the various components or modules, and again field any questions you might have, viewers. I also have a few, so I will post mine first, but if I see plenty of questions in the live chat, I will bring yours ahead of, I'll put yours ahead of mine. Okay, viewers. So, but there's latency, so please post them in the live chat ASAP. Thank you very much. So, Chris, let's trace again your steps back to engineering school days, where you considered a job in music, but those close to you were not so convinced of the idea, but music sat with you as a hobby for some time.
Yeah, I just loved music as a kid, and then became interested in electronics as well. And I was convinced I wanted to pursue music as a career. I wanted to either be a musician, or at least I wanted to be a recording engineer, something where I can be involved with sound and technology. And all my friends said, no, you don't. No, you don't want to do that. You'll either be a starving musician, or if you're a recording engineer, you'll be sweeping the floors. No, you don't want this life. It's like, okay, well, I seem to have an aptitude for this engineering thing. I know, I'll get an engineering degree and use that to fund music as a hobby. That was the grand plan. And it worked for 1 year. And then after 1 year, I got a job at Sequential Circuits, being an engineer making musical instruments.
So while you're at Sequential, did you ever consider that something like MIDI, you know, an organization of instruments, computers, and show production devices talking together was ever possible? You know, without control voltage and gates and things like that, that something like this would actually eventuate?
Well, I joined Sequential in 1984, which was 1 year after the MIDI 1.0 spec was agreed upon. And it was interesting to go back. I was reviewing some of the documents. Dave Smith of Sequential, may he rest in peace, proposed at the Audio Engineering Society show in 1981 something he called the Universal Synthesizer Interface. And as part of the intro, he said, look, I'm not in love with this idea. If others have better technology, that's great, but let's start a discussion. And back then, USI only was designed to connect a sequencer to one keyboard, or maybe one keyboard to one other keyboard. So I think back then, you know, people weren't really thinking of what would be possible when you could connect all these different devices together. I mean, Roland had their DCB, the digital control bus. Oberheim had their system. We could connect their sequencer, their drum machine, and the OBA keyboard. But I don't think anyone anticipated what MIDI was going to open up, particularly when we started adding non-music things such as show control, SMPTE timecode, etc., to the MIDI specification.
I have the paper that was presented by Dave at the 70th convention, AES convention, that you have kindly allowed me to display. So I've got it up now. I'll flip through the 10 pages very quickly.
I think in addition to the cover, it's very fun to stop on the first page of text where Dave lays out, if someone has a better idea, speak up, because I think that really shows, his approach. He was not in love with it having to be his. He just wanted what was best for musicians.
I'll flip through the 10 pages and then stop at the first page that Chris had just described. It's probably really small, but you could probably, viewers, zoom in if you want to or need to, or I could, I suppose. Let me see.
Yeah, that second paragraph. This is a preliminary specification.
Here we go. This is a preliminary spec. Comments, criticism, and alternative proposals are welcome.
Yeah, and those criticism and alternative proposals were almost the downfall of MIDI before it even came into being, because Dave started a conversation with other U.S. manufacturers who already had their own ideas at the time. Oberheim had the system, which was this parallel bus that connected between machines, very fast, powerful. Cable length couldn't be very long. Voyetra, if anyone remembers Voyetra technology,
yes,
they had a remote keyboard and a rack mount synth, and they had their own serial communication standard. So a lot of companies were playing around with ideas of how to interconnect their own instruments back then. But each one was in love with their own technology. They said, no, you have to do it my way, your way isn't very good. And Dave got very disheartened by this competitive nature of the US companies who would not agree for the good of the industry. They just said, well, my technology is better, you should use mine. So that made Dave change and go talk to Japanese companies instead. And I think they had a longer range view of what the market could be. Back then, what was a very common thing was Japanese companies had a 5-year plan. Try to look 5 years into the future and plan on how you're going to get there. And I think companies such as Roland in particular, but also Yamaha, Korg, etc., were thinking in those terms. And Roland donated significant portions of their own digital control bus. They made some changes to it. They changed the speed to make it a little bit easier to implement in the current synthesizers at the time, because the idea was to do it inexpensively. And then people agreed upon it.
Wow, so it's interesting how foresight is a very important part of being able to do product development, and product development that is for the good of all.
Yeah.
Rather than just the good.
A lot of the product development is what do you wish you had, and then go design it.
Yeah, think of what you want and then step backwards and see what you need to do to get to that.
And something I always found fascinating about MIDI is that it was never a cutting edge technology. It used a relatively slow clock, a 31.25 kbaud. The reason that they chose that strange number that did not relate to modem frequencies is that most of the keyboards back then had 8 megahertz main clocks for their processors, and it was easy to divide that down to 31.25. Again, the focus was, can we divide a clock we already have in our instruments instead of having to pay for another crystal? So there's a lot of thought about, it doesn't need to be the best, it just needs to be ubiquitous. It needs to be everywhere. And it was interesting because when I came on the scene in 1984, MIDI was less than 1 year old in terms of from the time of the specification. And already, like, Keyboard Magazine was running an article, Turmoil in MIDI Land. There's all these bugs and problems back in the early days before there was even 1 year. Because I think back then we had no idea that almost 40 years later we'd still be using MIDI.
What do you know? MIDI is my best friend, everyone. Yes, I will fight for MIDI anytime. Speaking of proof of the pudding, which is in the plugging, proof of the pudding is in the plugging. And I have a picture that you sent me, Chris, of Dave with the Prophet 600 and Kakehashi, no, let me get his, Ikutaro Kakehashi with his Roland Jupiter 6 at the 1983 NAMM.
Yeah, Dave's the guy with the beard. The person to Dave's right, to the left with the skinny tie, is actually Jim Mothersbaugh, one of the Mothersbaugh brothers from Devo, who was head of service at Roland at the time.
What do you know?
The person with his back to you is John Bowen, who was the product specialist at Sequential at the time. So it's fun to see some of these old faces. But yeah, they Roland brought their keyboard down to the Sequential booth, and said, let's plug it in. And Dave was seen later on the show just going, it worked. It worked. It worked. He's just so happy. But even then, there were problems. For example, the Prophet 600 had a mod wheel that was digitized and sent through the processor, but they only used 5 bits to record the mod wheel. And rather than push the numbers to what we call left justified, so they take the maximum range, they pushed it right justified. So the Sequential's mod wheel only did a small amount of modulation on the Roland keyboard. And then the Roland's mod lever quickly went way past maximum modulation on the Prophet 600. So these were the type of early problems we had. The Yamaha DX7, its keyboard velocity didn't really want to go, it didn't even reach 120. It had difficulty going over 110. So you played another keyboard into a DX7, you got brighter sounds than you ever heard playing a DX7's keyboard. DX7 connected to another instrument, you couldn't get as bright of a sound. So these were some of the early problems that Keyboard Magazine was focusing on Turmoil in MIDI land, where there was a lot of these unforeseen implementation of how to make it work with someone else's instrument. And it was the first time everyone had done it. They didn't get it perfect the first time. And I think it's interesting that I know in my case, I was hired into the service department of Sequential. The MIDI person at Oberheim, Ann Graham, was in the service department. Jim Mothersbaugh was in the service department. Back then, MIDI was actually put in the land of service rather than necessarily the land of the engineers and instrument design, which I thought was kind of, people didn't realize back then how important MIDI was going to become.
Yeah. So what were some of the issues you found in the MIDI implementation of the sequential synthesizers then when you were first hired to join the service department, as you explained to us last round?
Yeah, for example, not all the instruments agreed where middle C was. They might be one octave off from each other as to where middle C was. There was the range issue I mentioned with the mod wheel on Sequential's instruments, particularly the Prophet 600 compared to the other instruments. And I basically had to go through each of Sequential's instruments one at a time, fixing little bugs like that, like whether or not it could. There was a few different ways of sending MIDI notes, whether or not you had to have a status byte in front or you could skip it to save time. Some instruments had that wrong. Some instruments would send a note off with 0 velocity, some would, or a note on with 0 velocity, some would send a note off with its own velocity. So there's all these little variations that people didn't take into account. But the fun part for me at Sequential of going back to the instruments was going like, what can I add to these things? What can I do to make it more interesting? For example, some instruments started to have aftertouch. An instrument like the Prophet 600 does not have aftertouch. Well, I could take the incoming MIDI control and route it to the same place that the mod wheel went. So someone could use aftertouch remotely while playing a Prophet 600. In the drum tracks, Sequential's drum machine, I had a lot of fun adding some things where I could use MIDI notes to retune the drums over MIDI instead of just doing it from the front panel controls. So the fun challenge for me was not only fixing the bugs in the instruments, but also saying, what features can we add? What more things can we give the user back then in each of those instruments? And it became a part of there was regular new firmware updates for the Sequential products that were adding features to them that could be accessed over MIDI.
I like how you took language and you made it take on multiple roles. Because MIDI is a language or communication protocol, and you said to yourself, well, it's got all these features and functions of vowels and consonants. What else can I do with it? And besides just speaking English, what other languages could I speak that use the vowels and consonants for?
Yeah, that instrument speaks with a different accent. Okay, let's make sure, we use those slang terms with that different accent, or at least are compatible with it, or maybe can do something interesting with it. And that was a large part of it, is how do we make these things more interesting?
I like the way you think, Chris Meyer. So you were technical chairman of the MIDI Manufacturers Association in the 90s. You must have seen a multitude of designs, some that made it commercially and some that did not. Would you like to share some of these ones that kind of made you think about them a bit more, with more effort?
Well, the
that
interesting
intrigued
thing
you?
back then is a lot of companies were still trying to improve MIDI in the early days. As I mentioned, the technology is not very advanced. It wasn't very fast. Some people would talk about, there's so many subjects to talk about, I have to sort them in my head. Some people would talk about MIDI delay, but it would take under 1 millisecond to send a MIDI note. Most of the delay was in an instrument receiving MIDI and handling it. But companies would come up with ideas like one company proposed a trinary rather than a binary language for MIDI, where there's +1, 0, and -1. Other companies wanted to use fiber optic links. Companies had all these different proposals, but they always said, but it's my technology and I have a patent on it, and you have to pay a license to me to use this. And that was not going to work with MIDI. The idea of MIDI was everybody could use it. No one profited off of somebody else using it. It was put out there as a spec. It was never made an official standard. It was just a specification that other companies could follow. And without that, if you had to have a patent or someone's permission to use MIDI, there's no way it would have been as widespread. So even though it was a very hampered technology, the fact that it was easy to put everywhere is what made it successful. But we had a lot more fun with it. We were talking about a couple things in the chat beforehand. More people came up with ideas of what they wanted to add to it. I had an interest in doing sound effects work for film, for example. So that world worked with simply timecode. They don't work with beat counts. So I proposed a way of adding simply timecode into the MIDI spec. It's now known as MIDI timecode as part of the spec. Jerry Lester at Adam Smith, the company that did tape deck synchronizers, was an important part of that back then. People like Robert Rich, the musician, was very interested in microtonal tuning and alternate tunings like you played. They came together and came up with a unified specification of, we'd like to send this over MIDI to instruments to have them retune their keyboards. And I helped push that through. Some people wanted to do remote tape machine control. That became MIDI machine control. Some people wanted to control lights and smoke and fans. So that became MIDI show control. But the interesting thing was we had all these Americans and Europeans innovating, coming up with all these things they wanted to send over MIDI. And the way MIDI was built was kind of a strange structure. There was the Japanese MIDI Standards Committee, which represented the Japanese manufacturers. And there was the MIDI Manufacturers Association, which represented the American and the European manufacturers. And I was technical chairman off and on for the MMA. And we kept voting on these proposals, refining them, sending them to Japan, and nothing was coming back. They weren't signing anything. They weren't agreeing to any of these additions we were making. So finally at one NAMM show, outside the bar of the Marriott, people who've been to NAMM shows know the Snake Pit Bar, I sat down with the heads of the Japanese MIDI Standards Committee and said, we have to find a way to resolve this. What's going on? And they said, well, our members don't see a reason for show control and machine control and all this crazy stuff. That's why we're not approving it. And I'm saying, well, our members do find a use for this and are creating new industries and new applications. So we came up with an agreement that if none of their companies in Japan had an objection to a proposal, then they would allow it to pass. Before they said we had to find a reason to pass it, and I said, no, change it so you don't have a problem with it, then let it pass. And that was a big change in how we administered MIDI between those two bodies. And that opened up the floodgates to get a lot more things added to the MIDI specification.
Phew, I'm glad I wasn't in your shoes.
For me, I was like this 20-something with its responsibility on my shoulders. And I just like, like shaking inside, like negotiating this thing. And I'm so happy we got it through and pulled it off.
Thank you so much for doing your job. Because of what you did, we have what we have. Do you recall any product specs with, kind of like exaggerated marketing claims during your time as a tech chairman of the MIDI Manufacturers Association?
MIDI Manufacturers, the MMA.
The MIDI Manufacturers Association.
The Maxi Manufacturers. I don't remember so much crazy claims, but we did have issues with how some instruments handled MIDI.
Yeah.
And there was particularly a story where misreading someone else's documentation can take you in a crazy direction.
Okay.
But there was a demonstration, for example, though, at an Audio Engineering Society technical conference that was supposed to demonstrate that MIDI is too slow for music.
Oh.
And they showed playing fast series of notes into a DX7, and very quickly what was supposed to be a set of distinct chords just became a cycling arpeggio.
Uh-huh.
But I'm in the audience doing math on the back of an envelope in the audience, and I realized, no, MIDI's fast enough to play all those chords. It was the DX7 that couldn't play the notes fast enough, and was turning them into this slur of notes rather than individual chords. Because the way a lot of instruments worked back then was very discrete. For example, a lot of sequential instruments had 6 voices or 8 voices in them. And what they would do is they would serve one voice every millisecond, update everything that voice needs. Okay, now go back, look at the front panel. Next millisecond, service the second voice. Okay, look at the front panel. Oh, it's a new millisecond. Look at the third voice. And that meant by the nature of the design of the instruments, there was no way they were going to start a chord at the same time. They were always going to splay them out by milliseconds. Now that's inside the Haas effect or the precedence effect. That just kind of shows the instruments were incapable of playing precisely timed music back then. And also, some manufacturers, when they were pulling, then go do something else. And pull another note. Oh, I got the end of the note. I'm going to go play that note, come back later. And that's what caused these delays in playing MIDI notes. And I ended up writing a lot of the MIDI handlers or fixing them for sequential instruments. And our philosophy was clear out the buffer. Read everything you can out of the buffer, do it now. And that's why we got a reputation, particularly for instruments like the Prophet 2000, 2002, of having tight timing compared to other instruments, even if our instruments were slow. So that was kind of an important thing back then.
Whoa. Gee, I'm glad I wasn't in your shoes once more.
Well, back then you don't think you're doing anything special. You think you're doing your job.
I hear
you. You think you're fixing. Someone's identified a problem. Then you go try to fix it.
Yeah.
Now, one problem I tried to fix that was a mistake on my part is Yamaha started making dedicated chips just for handling MIDI, and they had a spec sheet for it. And part of the spec sheet showed that it could go up to 128K baud. I was like, what's Yamaha doing? Are they about to introduce faster MIDI? What's going on here? So in response and sequential, we put modes in some of our instruments like the Prophet 2000 and the Prophet VS to talk at least double speed. Because we anticipated, Yamaha's going to do this, we have to go do that. And no, that was just, Yamaha Japan said, no, Yamaha US should never put that in the spec sheet. That's not something we plan to do. We're never going to do that. But I was already reacting, like, we have to go do this faster thing. And it was challenging back then because with notes coming in twice as fast, the buffer filled up much faster. And there was less time to do things like look at you changing the knob on the front panel and other performance things. But it still came in handy. There was a strange electric guitar back then called the Synth Axe that broke the fretboard into one part and then the picking section into another part.
We actually had a guest on, Chris Curell, who played with Michael Jackson on all his tours, who used one. He was looking for a synth guitar to trigger the synclavier amongst other instruments. So he showed us that we had pictures of it, and he talked about it and all. But please continue.
So we worked with that company at the time, and we put in a mode in the Prophet VS where they could exchange messages back and forth saying, "Can you go up to double speed?" And if the message came back like, "Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Here I am," then the Syntax could send MIDI messages twice as fast, which was very handy because it was so expressive. It had so much data it could send when you played it. And we did something similar with the Prophet 2000 sampler with Digidesigned Sound Designer. It takes a long time to send samples over MIDI, so we had a mode where we can negotiate. Can you talk faster? You can? Okay, good. And then send samples at double speed just to make the transfer go faster.
Wow, I like that. So to our viewers, Roland Craig, you said you have a question about the math. If you really do, please ask it. But for viewers who are interested in Chris Curel's syntax, it's on my live stream. It's archived as well. So after Chris Meyer's live stream, you might, if you're interested in the other Chris's live stream about his syntax, you can hop over there and check it out. But what do you think then, Chris Meyer, about some people who claim that MIDI is not expressive at all?
It comes down to how you use it. It does have lots of different expression commands you can send over it, including a lot of were unassigned controller messages with the idea people could use them as desired. And the general MIDI specification, a lot of people think of general MIDI as just being, oh, there's preset group of sounds, it's only good for playing back scores. But as part of the general MIDI spec, it agreed upon all of these different performance parameters that are now part of the MIDI spec that a lot of people don't look at and use. Now, for expressive control, you do want a faster communication than 31.25 kbaud. So something like a direct USB connection is going to be much better for that. There was ways beforehand of using one channel for each note you were playing to send all the expression for that one note. It was a very common way of handling it, like an MPE type implementation back then. Now we have MIDI 2.0, which makes that much easier, but companies have been very slow to adopt that so far.
Yeah, I've been waiting for a good MIDI 2.0 keyboard controller so I could explore, environments I've never considered before, or I have considered but just never had the right device to do so.
Yeah, I would expect Yamaha to be one of the companies to do that, because Yamaha was very active in defining what MIDI 2.0 could be. And therefore, I'm kind of a little surprised, actually, that they don't already have a line of MIDI 2 products. But I've not been keeping up with them. But I know that they at least have been thinking about this, and hopefully we'll see something from them.
So why do you think it took almost 4 decades for 2.0 to wow us with its upgrades?
It's funny because I was talking to Tom White, who was the president of the MIDI Manufacturers Association for many years, and he said it's my fault, even though that I had left a long time ago. Because when I was running the technical committee, we had the philosophy of a company would propose something, other people would comment on it, and out of this group think, we would improve that proposal, then vote on that and send it out. And we were very flexible for doing that. When I wrote the MIDI timecode specification, everyone had worked on it, had agreed upon it, and said, okay, let's go vote at this NAMM show. And at a NAMM show, Jerry from Adam Smith's got up and said, I think I have a better way of doing it. We're like, okay, we've just spent months trying to work on this. So we went on this strange thing and said, okay, this is what we're going to do, Jerry. First, let's vote on the proposal that we all have, see if we approve that, then tell us what you're thinking, and then if we agree, we'll vote on your proposal. So we passed the original proposal. Jerry got up on a whiteboard, showed indeed a better way of sending timecode, and everyone said, makes sense to me. So we canceled the new specification like in under half an hour and came up with an update to it. But that was the mindset back then. Okay, who's got the better idea? Who's got the better technology? And I'm told I was not part of the MIDI 2.0 discussion, so I was not in the room. I don't know what happened. But Tom White told me the way that companies like to do standards now is a company comes with a complete specification and say, take my complete spec or nothing.
Oh.
And then so companies kept fighting about whose complete specification you should take, and it took them that many years to reach consensus. They weren't used to the idea of, let's take some of this, take some of that, put them together, make something better. Instead, they were stubborn and said, no, you have to take mine. No, you have to take mine. At least that's what it was explained to me, and I'm told it was my fault because I insisted on consensus rather than people just saying, okay, popularity contest, we'll pick yours. Yeah.
But isn't it an association rather than
It's
my company?
It's supposed to be collaborative. And again, I've been out of that environment for a very long time. But back when I worked at Sequential Circuits, for example, EMU Systems was literally just over the hill. And the engineers at both companies knew each other. We were friends. We had dinner together. We'd go to parties together. And the engineers between Sequential and EMU would help each other solve each other's problems. Because we were just used to, we love music. We want cool instruments. Let's help each other make cool instruments. As opposed to this competitive, it must be mine sort of approach that I guess became more common later on.
That's a little sad that some of us think a bit more on a self-centered level. But the rest of us are good, aren't we? Yes, we are. We work together. We like to collaborate.
I could be characterizing this all wrong. This is just what I was told. Like, why did it take you so long? Because, and then this is what I was told. So.
Well, we have a question from Roland about the math. He was curious as to how you So he said, when were you doing math in the audience? When you were doing math in the audience, how were you doing that?
Well, I knew in my head, because this was ingrained in me as an engineer, that each byte takes 320 microseconds over the standard MIDI 1.0. So if you send the entire 3-byte message for a note, it's just under a millisecond. If you use a trick in MIDI called running status, it's 2/3 of a millisecond. So I could sit back there and go, okay, they claim they're playing, 5 6-note chords. Let's say 6-note chords.
Okay.
That should take less than 6 milliseconds, maybe as little as 4 to send over MIDI. Haas effect says if sounds are within 12 to 15 milliseconds, you hear them as one sound, but we're hearing them as individual sounds out of the instrument. That's why I went, no, the MIDI transmission time is inside the precedence effect, it's inside the Haas effect. We're hearing individual notes. That's got to be on the instrument side, not on the MIDI side. So it's just the fact that back then we were writing in assembly language. We're counting every clock cycle, so we're very conscious of every microsecond back then, and that's why I can sit back and go, no, that's wrong.
I'm surprised no one else picked it up, or no other groups of people picked that up.
Well, here's the frustrating thing. It was an Audio Engineering Society meeting. They had microphones set up.
Yeah.
I went up to a microphone to say, okay, I did the math. This doesn't work. And they said, well, we're running late. People want to have lunch. And they cut off, no questions.
Ooh, it's a conspiracy.
No, it's poor management.
We don't care what issues are at stake here. We just want lunch.
Well, yeah, that's it. People didn't care about getting it right. They just cared about the show. This person made their presentation. Let's have lunch. Next presentation. As opposed to, we're all in this room together. We're all smart people. We're all engineers. Let's talk it out. And there was too little of that, in my opinion. So.
Yeah. Oh, well, there you go. We hope we learn from history.
Yeah, if we remember it. We don't always remember history. So.
That's true, and that's another topic. But I want to say hello from our new viewer from Italy. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly, and I'm not sure which is your first name, but I think it's Gazali. Let us know if that's correct. You may chastise me if I got that wrong and teach us how to say your name properly, but welcome. What time is it in Italy right now?
Pizza slice emojis, I can read that. I know what that means. I'm half Italian as well, so pizza. Oh, okay.
Pizza! But then again, you have to say it properly like an Italian.
Yeah.
Let us know if I got your name correctly. Maybe that was your last name, Ghezaili. But let us know if I got it right, and which part of Italy you're tuning in from, and what time it is in Italy right now.
It's very late there. I'm
very
surprised
late.
they're up. It's great that they're just staying awake for this. I really appreciate it.
So do I. Thank you so much. So again, let us know how to say your name and what time it is where you are. And thank you so much for being here. So we're moving on to part 2, unless someone else has MIDI questions. It's always intriguing to dig up the past and to know what happened and what transpired to give us the results that we have now. And hopefully we can all learn from each other and learn from history. It's interesting. I've been teaching a module called The Art of Story, and the topic was about how we like to learn from other people. So we learn from pattern, and one of these patterns was learning from success and failure. And after that, to remind my students, you've made a mistake like this before, so don't do it again. Learn from your own success and failure. But it would be nice if we all learned from history. So keep that in mind now. Let's move on to part 2, and it's all about modular synthesis. And this would be a good time as any to post your questions you might have for Chris already. I'm sure you saw our round 1, or you've been to Chris's website, Learning Modular, or you've been to seen his other material, perhaps his performances, and you have questions for him. So this is a good time to post them in the live chat. There is a latency. We can't avoid that. So even though MIDI 2.0 has jitter reduction, but it doesn't deal with latency. Likewise, in live streams, we don't have latency resolutions. It is what it is. So please put your questions in the live chat ahead of time. You probably also noticed the ambient light in my room has been dimmed. It's because it's raining quite heavily. So I am not sure about the weather, excuse me, where you are, but it is stormy right here. I feel like the weather lady. So Chris, I want to display a picture that you sent me to get this started off. And it's a picture of Brother Ron's studio.
Yeah, my brother's responsible for getting me in all sorts of trouble. My brother's 10 years older than me. Was into sound, he was into video, so he's the one who got me interested in music, electronics, video, etc. And my interest in music back then, I said, okay, I need to start learning how to play musical instruments. And the funny thing was, my parents had tried with my brother and sister to say, okay, you should learn how to play musical instruments. They were not interested. So they didn't even try with me. And when I said I want to learn how to play piano, that seems to be what is used to control a lot of synthesizers back then. Mm-hmm. They said, fine, buy a piano, go learn how to play it. So in this picture, you see a Wurlitzer EP200 piano, which I bought on my 16th birthday, bought it used. Got to see Todd Rundgren's Utopia later that night. This was a wonderful day. But in addition to piano lessons, I took synthesizer lessons. And I took synth lessons from this person named Pat Gallagher. He was the local Steiner Parker representative in the Midwest. So that big silver box you see in the back left is a Steiner Parker synthesis system. And that's actually the system I learned on as a teenager. And the keyboard to the right, which is duct taped on top of the Wurlitzer, I'm glad he never saw that photo, is the keyboard controller for the Steiner Parker. And we were talking about in chat that one of the things the Steiner Parker keyboards could do is invert the keyboard, like our 2600s and Joe Zollner would do as well. So I said, okay, I want to go try to record some music, try to make some music. Mm-hmm. And I had the whole recording process wrong back then. I didn't realize you actually had to have some music in mind before you try to actually record something. But I assembled all this equipment in my brother's house. He had reel-to-reel tape decks, he had mixing consoles, speakers. I brought my Wurlitzer piano. I rented from my teacher his Steiner Parker synthesis system. You'll see in the foreground a couple Electro-Harmonix pedals there, a memory man delay, and a small stone phase shifter. I own those too because I processed my bass through them. On the ground is a really crappy pair of headphones, mono headphones for my shortwave radio. So that I was really kind of shoestringing back then. I was just a teenager. But this was my first attempt to record my own music with my piano I had bought and the synth that I had learned synthesis on. And nothing good came out of that session because I had no music ideas at the time.
I was gonna ask.
But this was the system. This is how I started out as a teenager back then.
So speaking of shoestring, whose shoes are those below the...
That's my brother Ron's shoes peeking through there in the background. He's set up his mix position by the fireplace, and behind that is his mixing console on a reel-to-reel.
Got it. Hey, brother Ron. So we have a couple of pics that I want to display as well that Chris has sent me. The first is an early setup that he had back in engineering school, and there are a couple of devices or pieces of equipment or instruments that he still possesses. I believe there's the Paya Modular and a Dennis Electronics control voltage processor.
Yep, in this picture, when I went off to college, I sold the electric piano and used it to buy my first modular, which was a Paya modular synthesizer, an American kit out of Oklahoma back then. And these were pretty you talk about shoestring, these were very cheap modules. What is the least expensive modular synth they could come up with back then? But even back then, I had a lot of fun modifying. If there was any trimmers inside, like the symmetry of the sine wave or the symmetry of a triangle wave, I would bring those out to new potentiometers on the front panels of those. It had a lot of problem with hum and a noisy power supply. I was replacing the capacitors on the modules with bigger capacitors to try to make it quiet. So the two cabinets in the bottom and the smaller cabinet with a brown wood case around it are the Paya modular. Viewing from this angle to the left in that nice koa wood case is something called a Dennis Electronics control voltage processor, or CVP. Danny Genovese was a guy in Honolulu, Hawaii, who tried to make his own modules. He advertised the control voltage processor. He made 5 of them. He sold 1 of them. He kept 1 of them, and he shipped me the other 3.
Whoa.
I loaned 1 of them to a person at EMU Systems and never saw it again. And I still have the other 2 control voltage processors that he gave me back then when I was a teenager. And if you're wondering what a CVP is, it is the equivalent of a make noise maths, but back in the 1970s. It had slew limiters, Schmidt triggers, inverters, offsets, mixed control voltages, could do feedback. It has so many of the features that are now in maths, the most popular Eurorack module available, but back in the 70s. And I'm sure Make Noise has no idea that those things existed because only 1 was ever sold. So there's no way they could have seen one. But that was in my early dorm room college days. This was the synth that was with me in my dorm room.
Well, what do you know? You got some eyeglasses there perched on top.
Yeah, I was a big Devo fan back then. And one of the things that they had was you could buy their 3D glasses, and that's what I had packed up there, my Devo glasses. And in another pictures, you'll see the Devo Energy helmet and all this other crazy stuff.
Anyone with questions for Chris so far? Everyone's so quiet. That's not good. Come on, pipe up. All right, so thanks Chris, we have another picture of a much later rig where you still see Chris's Paya system, but it's a little more enlarged, I believe. And
yes, it's growing now. I've added more cabinets of modules to it. I now have 2 of the control voltage processors built into 1 cabinet up on the left. I actually have a brand new cabinet for those up in the garage. I'm in the process of 57 microphone I still have today that's up on top there. On the right is a WEM, a Watkins Electromusic Copycat Tape Echo.
Yeah, I love the sound of that. It's just, you can't replicate that at all. Nothing comes close to it. It's got the wow effect for me anyway.
Oh, it definitely has a wow effect, a lot of wow and flutter to it.
The wow effect.
The one I got was modified because normally the 3 playback heads are pretty close after the record head. But in my unit, they had detached the heads and moved them further around, including one on the back side of the tape loop to do longer delays.
Ooh.
And they also added a switch to it that turned off the erase head to do sound on sound.
Ooh.
So it was quite an unusual unit.
Do you still have it?
I do not. I sold that a while back. I had this tape echo, and I had a tape echo that was based on 8-track tape cartridges.
Whoa.
That I bought off of Robert Rich and used for a while, and then I sold that as well quite some time ago. Because I'm always selling gear that I'm not using to buy more gear. And if something's not getting used, it gets sold so I can buy something else.
Of course. You're forgiven.
And then my 4-track reel-to-reel to the right, and then a parts cabinet of all my little electronic parts for modifying the PIA next to that.
Nice. Anyone with questions? Everyone's mesmerized by looks of it. No one. Everyone's still.
I tend to give information overload, and I apologize for that.
I'm not the only one. Phew. There's so much to process. It's just like a flight of fantasy tale. You just flying along with it. You can't stop. No pausing. Anyway, the live chat is there, my dear friends. If you have questions, please pop them in there. Roland has another one about the year of these pictures. What year are these pictures from?
Okay, this picture is probably around 1981 or 82 back then. I'll tell you what this is from. If you notice the white brick wall behind with the black lines,
yeah,
that's because I was trying to make my dorm room look like the cover of Pink Floyd's The Wall.
Oh.
So whatever year Pink Floyd's The Wall was released, that's when this photo's from.
Someone Google it quick, please. Thank you. And the previous picture?
That would have been my first year in college. Was in the 1979 was my first year in college.
There you go.
So that photo was probably around 1980. Yeah, that was probably 1980 or so.
Roland thanks you, and he says that was a good answer. I didn't know Chris was being assessed, Roland. Okay, thanks, Roland, for your question and answer. I do have a picture, Chris, of your. I've been calling it your bespoke Sonic 6.
Oh yeah, this is a fun instrument.
Shall I do a little history on the Sonic 6 first? Let me do a little history. For those of you who do not know, the Sonic 6 was derived from the Sonic 5, naturally, which was, if I'm not wrong, designed by ex-Moog employee Gene Zamchek.
Zamchek?
Yes, who was
for Musonics, yeah.
Yeah, who was co-founder with Bill Waitner of Musonics. If you want another plug for my live stream, we had Jim Scott and Herb Deutsch on a live stream not that long ago, and they talked about this period in history. So if you're interested in that period of history, go over and check the live stream with Jim Scott and Herb Deutsch after Chris Meyer's. But Bill Waitner bought over and merged Moog Music during a time when Moog Music wasn't doing particularly well. And subsequently, Bob took the Sonic 5, did some mods on it, and voila, you have the Sonic 6. That's my summary.
Yeah, actually, I wrote a little bit of that history line for the back section of Patch and Tweak, the Modular Synthesis book. But also, you might be aware of the book called Synth Gems on vintage synthesizers that was written by Mike Metley. And I actually edited that book. And also we talk a lot about the Musonics and the history of the Sonic 5 becoming the Sonic 6, etc.
Okay.
So where this came from was, there's a guy by the name of John Bowen who worked at Moog Music as a product representative, then went over to work for Sequential Circuits. John's the one who laid out the front panel for the Prophet 5, for example. Did a lot of the patches, most of the patches for the sequential instruments, etc. For some reason, even though John worked at Moog, I guess he really wanted an ARP 2600. So he took the Sonic 6 out of its nice plastic case with his keyboard and built it into this plywood slant case that was slanted like an ARP 2600. Then underneath on the right, he put a sequential Model 700 programmer. This was their second product, and the idea was to add preset programmability to a mini mode. So it allowed you to create semitone offsets for each of the oscillators, and would memorize them so you could call up different tunings. The long row of knobs underneath this added a pair of ADSRs to it, memorized all those settings, so you can memorize envelopes, plug those into the envelope inputs in the mini mode. And then along the bottom are the different patch selector buttons. So he built one of those into the case. And then on the left, he originally had a sequential Model 800 digital sequencer, which was Sequential's third product. And all that was before the Prophet 5. But it didn't work. So I wanted to make this more usable. So what I did was I took a blasted electronics frequency divider that I had built from a kit for my Paya, donated it to this cause. We took the microphone input that's part of the Sonic 6, and I handed this all over to Gene Stopp. Gene was responsible for designing a lot of instruments, maintaining a lot of instruments. He helped maintain Keith Emerson's Big Moog for a while. He worked for Moog Music and worked on the vintage reissue instruments. I said, Gene, can you build this up a better patch panel, integrate my frequency divider, make some multiples, make some level shifters into it, and just make this a more usable instrument. So all the really nice work, particularly in that lower left panel, is Gene Stopp's work to add to this. So I had this, and I had the idea of maybe I was going to perform live with this thing, because back in the late 90s, early 2000s, what I would do is I would act as the drummer playing behind bands, but using loops and stuff like that, process through all sorts of gear, including process through synthesizers. I had a Korg MS-20 for a while, a few other strange things, but I thought about bringing this out live with me, but it was just too big and cumbersome and unreliable. So after not using it for years, I can't stand to hold on to something and not use it. I want to see it used. So the NAMM show, I took it in and gave it back to John Bowen. At this point, John had started his own company called Solaris Synths, and he designed the Solaris synthesizer. And we put it as a display piece in the back of his booth, and it got a lot of attention during the course of the trade show, because a lot of people had never seen a Moog Sonic 6 as it was, let alone this strange creature that John made and then Gene Stopp had finished.
Wow, there you go. Another interesting story. Whoa. It'd be tough to transcribe each and every word of the entire live stream, that's for sure. There'll be chapters and chapters and more chapters of this huge tome of a feature book. But at this point again, any questions for Chris? No? Well, I do. Chris, in our last chat, you expressed how you look for musical partnership with your hardware and your software, such that you are the band leader of your ensemble of instruments. I did a little poking around, and I noticed that a couple, at least two, of your compositional preferences look to encompass probability style generative devices and timbral textural evolution. I remember we used the word evolution previously. How I came to this conclusion was you had mentioned you used the vector and numerology sequences, and I also spotted on the online modular grid Eurorack that you have a Rene Cartesian sequencer. I also spotted plenty of filters and wave shapers and a clouds texture synthesizer, which intrigued me a lot. So I was wondering if you'd like to expound on these two compositional methods or preferences, as I call them, and beyond, so that we understand and can appreciate what goes through your mind as you look to compose or play or improvise or whatever it is you do when you want to set out on a musical journey, and how you put your hardware and software devices together. What makes you give an item away and purchase an item for your ensemble?
That might be more than one question, so we'll see what we can get through.
I was giving you scope.
Yeah,
Giving you some scope.
It's interesting, because I have to admit that I started learning musical instruments pretty late, when I was like 15 or 16. Only had the very basics of music theory, and right before I went to college, I had an accident where I fell through a window, and among other things, got a lot of stitches in my left hand.
Oh dear.
And I couldn't close my left hand for 6 months because of all the damage I'd done to it. So what little skills I had on keyboard and bass guitar at the time atrophied. And now I'm in college, I couldn't even use my hand. So I'm not an expert instrumentalist, and I don't have a big music education in music theory, etc. But I have an ear for what sounds that I like. And then as I started improvising with other people, I started improvising with more jazz-oriented musicians, and kind of applied an engineer's mind to it of like, what's going on here? How are decisions being made on what to do next? And even though I don't have the deep knowledge of chords and modes and harmonic structure and things like that that other people have, how can I take advantage of other tools to give me the equivalent of that? And I found that my own approach to music became really similar to granular synthesis. Granular synthesis is based on the idea of, let's take all these individual small grains of sound and control how dense it is. Is it a continuous sound or little spots of sounds with silence in between? How much frequency range do they take up when they're transposed over? Are there variations in timbre in between the individual grains, so we're mixing together different sounds? And I found that I started taking a compositional approach of composing notes as if they were grains. Starting with maybe a simple sequence of like 4 or 8 notes, but then controlling what was the spacing in between those notes. How dense were the patterns, or how much space was there between the patterns? How much did I start harmonically stacking them in addition to spacing them out horizontally? How did I change the timbre of the sounds over their life? So this became my way of improvising music, is not necessarily picking what note should I play next or what chord or key I should modulate to next, but this granular approach of how dense is it, what frequency content is it taking it, how am I evolving the timbre? And I've always tried to find instruments and modules that make it easier for me to work in that way, because that's how I think when I'm composing music and when I'm improvising it. Does this section need to be busier? Does it need to be more sparse? What frequency range do I need to be occupying as opposed to what individual notes I'm playing? So that has a lot to do with my criteria. So for the keyboard sense, since I am not a keyboard whiz, I'm instead interested in timbral evolution. I'm interested in being able to play relatively few notes and having that sound change rather than just being a block of harmonics like playing an organ. That was the thought behind vector synthesis, was how can we make a sound continue to evolve while you're holding a note down? And the other instruments that I own, such as Korg Wave Station, Waldorf Iridium, ASM Hydrasynth, I have an Asonic Fismo off in the corner. All these were chosen because they are very good at evolving sounds as I hold down these individual notes. On the modular side, I picked a sequencer, the 512 vector, which allows me to set up probabilities to treat notes the same way that I would treat grains of sound. How dense are the notes, or how spaced out are the notes? What variations am I throwing in? And I found myself basically trying to program the machine to react like I would if I was an improvising musician. Because since I played with a lot of jazz-oriented people back in the 90s and 2000s, although I like trance-based music, I like there to be variations as well, because I know drummers throw in variations. As a bass player, I threw in variations. So it became a matter of how could I teach my instrument or find modules that allow me to put in variations. For example, if I have a 4 or 8 note sequence, to keep that musical line interesting rather than being repetitive, I may say every now and then this note should be double struck. Ratcheted is the term that gets used a lot.
Right.
This note should maybe occasionally play the 4th or 5th above it, or the 7th below it. Just maybe this note should be a grace note that happens before the downbeat, or maybe the next measure it does not get played. So I started taking these decisions I would make if I was a good performing musician, and programming the machine to say, these are what I would do, here's how often I would do it, what's the probability it's going to happen each measure. And then set up the machines to do that and send them off to go do their thing while I can go play other parts, change the timbre of the sound in real time, etc.
Well, thanks. You answered the entire scope of the questions. The umbrella of questions. Anyone again with questions for Chris? Everyone is so shy. Oh, good thing for you guys, I have more questions.
Oh, we're just overloading them with more information. But this does inform how I, for example, choose modules in my modular. I know we'll be spending more time with the big modular in a second.
Yeah.
For example, I like to program that not every note has the same duration or has the same release. A person playing a piano may use a pedal or a sostenuto on some notes. Others, they'll go ahead and lift it and mute it. How can I do that with a sequencer? Okay, well, I can use a sequencer line that puts out a voltage for, say, the release time. Well, then I need envelope generators that have voltage-controlled release. So as part of the ongoing evolution of my modular system, I now have only envelope generators that have voltage control over their times. So I can now program them to have that variation while I'm playing music with them.
Okay.
That's how my mindset goes. What do I want to do? What module is going to allow me to do that?
All right, sounds good. And we have a request from our good friend Chris, you and mine, Gary Yalton. We want to see that big modular, and that big modular is called the Monster. So, Chris, if you could humor us with a view of your Monster, please. Thank you so very much.
And excuse me while I walk in front of the camera to go sit next to it. Hi, everyone. Whoop.
Oops. Oopsie doops.
Almost pulled the microphone off of everything, which would not have been a good thing. But anyway, the Monster. So called because the case is a monster frame, that's its name, by a company called ADAC out of Portugal. And I found it was less expensive for me to buy this case and have them ship it over than for me to buy all the parts in the US and buy and build it myself.
Wow.
So that's why I started off with the monster frame case from them. I don't have a huge studio, so I have restricted myself to this is what my collection of modules is. Obviously, it's not a small collection, but this is it. It's got to fit into this for the studio. So whenever I want to add a new module, someone else has to come out to make room for it. And I'm constantly tweaking sections of it to optimize it for the way I like to perform.
Could you give us a quick idea of how you've organized all the modules?
Yeah, I'm very much into knowing subconsciously where everything is. In general, when you play music, when you have to make a conscious decision for something, that takes a lot longer time than when you have to make a subconscious decision. Mm-hmm. That's why people rehearse over and over again, so the piece of music becomes subconscious, and they can play it much more quickly than having to think about every single note. And I have the same approach when I'm working with my modular, is I don't want to have to go hunting for where a module is. I have broken things very largely into sections, so when I know I need a filter, they're all right here. And I'll point out those sections here in a second. Intermixed with that is realizing, well, it's all well and good to say my oscillators are here, my filters are here, my amplifiers are here, but sometimes you need utilities in the middle of each section, mixers, multiples, things like that. So over time, I've learned how to sprinkle inside the individual sections additional mixers, additional attenuators, additional VCAs. So inside an individual section, I can do the processing that's needed before the signal gets sent off to another section. Dead center is actually a mixer, the low gain submix. This is the first module I bought because I knew, among other things, I was going to need a mixer. This has 4 banks of 3, which can be treated as 4 individual lines of 3, 2 banks of 6 each, or 1 bank of 12, so it's very flexible. And it's in the middle of the case, because the idea was bring the signals into here, send them back out, bring them into here, send them back out. So that's why it's Grand Central Station next to an oscilloscope. I'm using a Mordax data because it's a 4-channel oscilloscope. And what I find to be very useful is whenever I'm learning a brand new module or whenever I'm debugging a patch where things aren't going right, I rely heavily on the oscilloscope to show me what's going into the module and what's coming out of the module. And whenever I'm learning a new module, I hook it up with this scope so I see what I'm sending it in, what it's sending back out again, and that gives me an understanding of what the module does behind the front plate. I don't want to be guessing what the module does. I want to know so later on I can use it subconsciously and say, oh, I know this module does this, da-da-da, go on. Because I don't want to break a creative flow trying to figure out how to realize my ideas on the modular. So overall, my philosophy on the modular is get the modules to do what I need, but also learn them so that when I'm being creative, I don't have to break my time up into what I call R&D, research and development, where I'm learning a new idea or learning a new module, put all those ideas in my back pocket, and then when it becomes time to compose with this, come up with a new patch, I've already done all of that work ahead of time, so it doesn't interrupt my creative flow when it's actually time to create music for it. So let's go through the sections of this piece, and I kind of broken things down into generally a left to right signal flow because a lot of instruments tend to have their front panels laid out that way. So I wanted, and that's how I learned. So I wanted to mimic that general left to right, top to bottom flow in the modular as opposed to just a front panel of a normal keyboard instrument. So in general, oscillators, filters, VCAs, output section down here, notes, sequencers come in here, flow to the oscillators, flow through the filters to the amps, out through the mixer. That's the general overall flow for the whole instrument. I have a row of my favorite digital oscillators here, and of course these things change over time. I really love the Dove wave plane oscillator because it's the closest thing to a vector synthesis oscillator that I have found in the modular format. I have one of the synthesis technology cloud terrariums that are really good at doing, it's a very clean wavetable oscillator to begin with, but it's also good for creating hazy clouds of sound, which is something I like, creating those timbral environments. I just recently put in a Modbap modular Osiris oscillator. I'm looking into getting into that and creating my own waveforms for that. A little micro braids, a version of the mutable instruments braids, not because it's the coolest module, but because it does many different things. It has a few dozen different synthesis algorithms in it. So if I need one more of this, or one more of that, or a special effect, I can go to that, and it fills in that hole. And I still have an old Waldorf NW1 wavetable oscillator because I personally love the sound of the PPG instrument. I have a groove synthesis third wave in order. I can't wait for that to come in. But I wanted to have a PPG-like sound inside my modular. Now, as it turns out, the NW1 does not sound like a PPG wave. It's a much of a later evolution. But it has lots of controls and CV inputs that allow me to alter the timbre over time. A lot of wavetable oscillators just allow you to change the wave, where this one has some additional things on its spectrum and EQ, noise components that go beyond just choosing the waveforms. That's why the NW1, although it's not a cool module and it's an old module, I like it because it allows me to do timbral evolution while I'm playing a sequencer line through it. So those are my, whoops, I have to remember where that went to later on. Into the data. Here we go.
You could play back the video later on too. Yeah,
so I can see where it goes. Yeah, I'm mid-patch. I'm working on a new song right now on it, so that's why it's in between state. This row are my favorite analog oscillators. So I have the Brenso from Frapp Tools, a 0-point oscillator for SSF, a trapezoid through zero quad oscillator from this. I guess you could say this is my FM oscillator row. A Doepfer through zero FM oscillator here, and then additional oscillators up here. I've got an old live wire audio frequency generator, one of my favorite modules because it produces different sounds. And one of the criteria for this system is every module has to do something different than somebody else in it. I'm not into having a homogeneous sound. The reason I have a big modular is to get different sounds. So to get into the case, that module has to do something different than anyone else in the case. That's how it gets admission, so I have a wider palette of colors to make music with. The audio frequency generator, instead of a normal square wave, it does pulses above and pulses below 0, and you can control those individually. You have 1 or 2 pulses above 0, 1 or 2 pulses below 0, and modulate each of those. So if you like square wave and pulse width modulation, this is that idea times 6. So that's why this is in the case, for example. In addition to tracking really well and having a very solid sound. I also have a WMD SSF spectrum oscillator because it has a couple alternate waveforms, among other things, very reliable. I have Bird Kids, a Battleur, because it has a built-in filter as part of the oscillator. So it allows me to go ahead and send control voltages, say from velocity or other expression like that, to the filter to basically wave shape the oscillator before it even comes out of the module. And that's why that's in here. Down here is my additive synthesis section, because I'm very much interested in building up sounds. Remember that the original synthesizer waveforms of square, triangle, sawtooth were not chosen because they were great for making musical instruments. They were chosen because they were easy to do in electronics, and they came out of test generators. So I'm not beholden to the idea of I must have sawtooths, I must have triangle waves. It's no, I want to craft my own sounds. The only reason we have those waveforms is because that's what was easy in 1960 with the electronics back then. So I have a couple additive ones, an analog, the verbose harmonic oscillator, and a digital one, the Odessa from Chaos Tools. And they're both very different sounds, really enjoy them. I love the fact that I can individually control the harmonics on both of these, so I can, again, perform the harmonic mix on those sounds while playing. And then this row is kind of like the weird stuff. Wave shapers, things like that. Surge wave multipliers, which has a few different ways of bending waveforms around. A super sawtor from Happy Nerding. But also this collection of modules here, they're kind of like basic sound modeling modules. Plucked strings, struck surfaces, things like that. And in my music, you'll hear quite a bit of struck and plucked sounds. Being a bass player and a percussionist, that's the type of sounds that I gravitate to. So it was very nice to have these modules that can create those sounds very quickly, maybe as a layer on top of another module, without having to make a big patch just to make a bell sound, for example. On the left side of all of these are extra modules that allow me to offset the tuning for every one of the oscillators. Different manufacturers have different ideas of how to approach modules. Some just have one giant frequency control, maybe with a small fine tune. Some modules have octave switches on them, other modules do not. So what I've added down here are a series of modules called Caltrans Modules by Clavis. Each one has 4 channels, and each one allows me to set the octave and the semitone transpose for each of the outputs. And those are then routed to each of the individual oscillators. So it makes it very easy for me to say, okay, I've layered these 2 oscillators. What would happen if I change the interval to this octave, to a 5th? Put this one below the other oscillator. Rather than having to manually retune and get things back in tune again, these allow me to just go click, click, click. Oh, okay, I can retune very quickly. And that becomes part of my performance, is actually doing live transposition of some of the oscillators while I'm playing as well. So that's just the oscillator section of this instrument. I don't use every oscillator on every song, but each one does something different. So when I'm working on a song and I hear in my head a particular sound, I can go to the module that produces that class of sounds and go to it very quickly. In the middle are a pair of programmable modules, the Nozori modules from Nozoid. They actually come with all these different panel overlays that allow you to say what are the different personalities of the module, which are changed by these little dip switches. So when I need another oscillator, another LFO, another noise source or something, that's here also in the center of the case. So those are the oscillators. Things come into the mixer. The data also has tuners built into it. So quite often, particularly during a performance, I will have things routed through here just to use the tuners to make sure everything's in tune. Through the mixer, then into my filter section. And again, the filters each have to sound different from each other for me to use them. Down here are my absolute favorite filters. The Rossum Evolution in particular, which is an evolution on the filter in Dave Rossum's EMU Modular, is my go-to filter. It is a Cadillac. It doesn't necessarily sound obnoxious or radical or crazy, but I know I can go straight to it and get a wide variety of very clean sounds out of it. It does have voltage controlled distortion on it if I want to dirty up a sound. Number of poles, other things, classic module. I also have Dave Rossum's Linnaeus through zero state variable filter with a lot of resonance. This is a digital filter, it's stereo. So I end up using it as a stereo EQ as often as I do as a filter inside my system. And it has some other really cool tricks like a built-in oscillator where it can modulate itself. I had fun working with Dave Rossum and Rossum Modular on this particular module. That was fun. Mannequin's Three Sisters, three filters in one module. They each can be 3 band passes or low pass, band pass, high pass. Very flexible module, but it's prone to overloading, to distorting. Oh. So I have a mixer right next to it where I can lower the levels of the things coming into it to get it out of that distortion zone. And just to make a little side trip, that's another one of the things I really focus on with my modular synthesis. It's easy to start with a clean sound and make it dirty. It's hard to start with a dirty sound and make it clean. So I focus on how do I get the cleanest sound I can out of this. So I really worry about signal levels going through different parts of it. In Eurorack, there's almost no headroom. It's really, really easy to clip things in Eurorack. As soon as you mix 2 oscillators, you're up against the limit of what it can do. Add a resonant filter, you're already clipping. So for me, managing signal levels is a big thing to make a sound clean or dirty, and to get different tones based on how hard I'm driving a module. That's just another side philosophy. So those are the analog filters. I also have a bionic Lester down here because it's a different type of filter topology. It's a digital filter, stereo again, but with a very different sound than the Rossum Linnaeus. So that's why it's in here. Up here are other filters that recreate sounds I really like. For example, one of my earliest instruments was an Oberheim 2-voice. I still have it. I love the sound of the state variable filter in the old Oberheim SEM, Synthesizer Expander Module. The dope for SEM comes the closest to it that I've heard out of any Eurorack module, at least for my ears. So I have to have one of those. The Wasp filter, I don't know if people have seen the little Wasp with the little keyboard that's just a membrane, battery-powered thing, had a very unusual filter design, very unstable resonance, so I have one of those. Chaos Belgrade filter, 2 filters where you can offset their relationship to each other, different sound again. The North Coast Leapfrog filter, which uses a different type of filter called an elliptic low pass, where it has a very sudden cutoff, but then further humps or accents in the high harmonics. Creates a very different sound. I have a Surge Variable Q VCF over here. Surge filters have a really lovely clean sound to them. If you like a highly resonant sound, the Surge Variable Q VCF, to me, has a really great juicy sound, as we like to say. And over here, I've been playing with different things. I'm supposed to have a Surge Variable Slope filter as well. I had someone build it for me. It never worked. He's never fixed it yet. So I keep swapping other modules down here. And I know Behringer is a bad word for many people. But I'm interested in the history of synthesizers. And one of the first state variable filters was designed by Dennis Cullen of ARP, and it went into the ARP 2500. So I have their version of that done by the guy from AMS who was replicating the various ARP filters before Behringer hired him, just because I want to hear that sound. I want to get that raw, early state variable filter sound. Dennis Cullen is also the guy who designed the filter in the Oberheim SEM. Most people don't know that. I want to compare the sounds. It may stay here, it may leave, something else may go in there. But that's because I'm constantly trying to optimize this for sounds that I like.
Yeah.
And then up here, I have my formant filters. I'm very much into not exactly replicating acoustic instruments, but borrowing from acoustic instruments what makes them interesting, and then applying that to make brand new sounds. So I'm not interested in trying to create the perfect clarinet sound. But I am interested in the idea of, oh, a vibrating tube has these various resonant peaks in it. That's what gives it a unique character. Then I need to have format filters so I can synthesize fresh sounds using those concepts. So I have a Grendel format filter up here, in addition to the three sisters, which a lot of people use as a format filter. But this is a particularly flexible one that I like. I have a digital format filter, the Moto Mouth filter from LimoFlow.
Wow.
It has many different vocalization type sounds that can be very precisely tuned. So it's a very different sound there. And playing a keyboard or playing a sequencer, each semitone brings up a different type of vowel sound. So it's very easy to sequence this and change its character from note to note while you're sequencing it, rather than staying the same. And then this is a new addition, the Surge Resonant Equalizer Mark II. In the original Surge modulars, one of its modules was a resonant, kind of what we would call a graphic EQ. But something that Surge did, which was very smart, is he didn't necessarily put things exactly on octave multiples like a lot of hi-fi systems graphic EQs do. He purposely offset them from each other so that so one note like a B that might resonate one band won't resonate all the other bands as well. They're each kind of accentuate a different note. And I was actually at a show and tell by Steve Roach, where he has a 5U version of this in his big .com modular. And he demonstrated how with just a sawtooth wave, which has all the harmonics, odd and even harmonics, he could play with different bands on the resonant EQ and really change the tone of it and come up with different vocalization sounds out of a normal sawtooth wave. So that's why I've added this recently to the system, and I want to experiment with that. So in between all of these different filters are basically my VCAs and my mixers. I have the submix that I pointed out earlier, but I have a crossfader. This is the happy nerding one. It's fun to go ahead and either, as part of performance, fade from one sound to another, as part of control voltage modulation, have a sound automatically morph between two different inputs. This module can also crossfade at audio rates. So one of the things I've played around with through my Learning Modular channels and videos, my Patreon videos, is what happens when you crossfade between two different waveforms at audio rates. What sort of harmonic structure do you get? There's some people who do switching between different waveforms at audio rates. To me, that's a very harsh sound. I found that crossfading is smoother. So I have one of those. I have a Verbose Pan and Scan, which is a 4-input mixer that can go ahead and scan across those 4 inputs to create different mixes of those inputs. Fun module. And then different VCAs, because even different VCAs sound different. I have an L1 discrete quad VCA because it's a very, very clean sound. It responds very quickly. So if I have a very fast envelope, I get like a real sharp click to the start of those sounds.
I see.
On the other hand, this case back here, which is a vintage from the 1970s, has a bunch of VCAs built on the old Aries synthesizer from the 1970s using an old part called the CA3080. It responds much more slowly. It's not as clean. So if I want to round off the attack of a sound, instead of running it through the very clean VCA in the L1, I run it through the old dirty VCAs over here, and it adds a roundness to a sound rather than a sharp, modern click to the starts of sounds. Tube-based VCA, dynamic impulse filter, which is similar to low-pass gate but has a variable characteristic to it. The Rabbit Elephant natural gate, which is their update on a low-pass gate, and then some optical VCAs and low-pass gates as well. So again, each module had to sound different than the module next to it. That's why I have even a variety of VCAs. And when I'm working on something like a bass line, I'll patch it into different VCAs to see which VCA enhances the character of that particular patch. That's kind of my approach to things. Underneath all of that, and there's some other modules scattered in here. Here's my sample player, Bitbox by 1010 Music. It's one of the very few samplers in Eurorack that can synchronize to a clock. I'm an Ableton Live user, so I'm used to the idea of lining up loops to a master clock and combining different loops. This is a Eurorack sampler that can do that, so that's why it's in the case. Steiner type filter to go ahead and do frequency crossfade. So there's a few odd modules inside here as well. This row is all of the modulation for the modules above it. Down here tends to be the LFOs, the random sources, etc. So I'll have things like Studio Electronics STE16, which is an LFO, but it's voltage controllable, has many different wave shapes, not just a triangle or a square wave shape. I have several different chaos-based modulators down here. I get some from Nonlinear Circuits. The Sonic Potions one, which is a different type of chaos. I have the Frap Tools Sapel, which is very similar to, actually it's an update on the Buchla dual function generator or the Surge dual universal slope generator. Similar ideas, but updated with some other cool things in it, like a ring modulator, some logic, etc. And other modules, quantizer, VCAs for mixing, utility mixer, a 6-time sample and hold, the random step by DivKid and SSF. This is a fun module because not only is it a sample and hold to create random voltages, quite often I'll sequence my triggers into this, have it generate random voltages to go ahead and modulate some other parameter inside here. It's unique among sample and holds in that it does not have an even distribution of random voltages. It does not treat all voltages the same. It clusters them around 0. And the further you get away from 0 volts, the less likely that voltage is to happen. And that kind of matches the way that I play music and do variations. Most variations are just little small changes from measure to measure, but every now and then you might throw in a wild variation for a measure, then come back again to your baseline where you started at, rather than being completely random. So this was a sample and hold that worked the way that I think of, like, just give me those occasional accents and otherwise give me small variations in between. So that's why I pick modules like that. But its output usually needs to be attenuated before it goes to another module, so I have an attenuator sitting right next to it. So there's these groupings, but then little things sprinkled inside just because I know I'm going to need this paired up with that. Another random source, the Marbles module from Mutable Instruments. This is a lot of fun. It can do trigger patterns, it can do random voltages, it can do random modulation. It took me close to a week to get my head wrapped around this because I had a preconceived notion of how it worked, and it didn't work that way. So I had to spend a week learning it, looking at what it was outputting, understanding it. Now it's one of the modules I use most of the time. I have a Duino. It's actually an Arduino processor behind a custom module done by Detroit Modular. I have this in here for one purpose. It recreates the envelope that's inside the Prophet VS with the looping segments, etc. Couldn't find a module that could do backwards forwards looping in the Eurorack. So I have this programmable module to do that one function because I use it in the Prophet VS all the time. Other envelope generators, like a Mutable Instruments Stages, which is kind of like a programmable envelope generator. The chaos device is Zadar, which rather than being a normal attack decay, has 240 different modulation shapes. And you choose which shape you want and how to warp that shape. So you get sounds out of that you cannot get out of a normal attack decay envelope. But then down here at the very end, I have some voltage controlled attack decay sustained release envelope generators as well. So I have, again, several different envelope generators, each one doing a different task or doing things in a different way, just to have that variety of sound. Then the rows below that are kind of like the input section and the output section. The input section is anchored by the vector sequencer that I mentioned from 512. I have one of these in my gigging case as well, because this just matches the way I like to make music. But I have some multiples next to it, some summers next to it, so I can go ahead and play a keyboard to transpose what the sequencer's doing. I have that patched into a few rhythm pattern generators that I like. I really love the Mutable Instruments grids for doing patterns. I have one of those here. And the ALM Pamela's new workout. There's a variety of different divisions and multiplications of clocks, in addition to modulation that's locked to a clock. That's part of the system here, along with a random burst generator. So very organized patterns, random patterns, all right here. Below that are kind of like a keyboard input device. I have an Expert Sleeper's FH2 for my controller keyboard. Allows me to get lots of different expression out of it, like velocity, aftertouch, the slider controls on it, etc. WMD Arptect, a special arpeggiator module they used, which I admit I've not really had a chance to really learn yet. So I haven't been using it as much. I need to spend some time learning that module. But it thinks the way that I think. That's why it's inside the case. So digital switches to go ahead and switch between sources, including a DPW switch and also an IntelliDel shifty to do hocketing. One of the common practices that Wendy Carlos did on her early switched on Bach, well-tempered synthesizer albums, etc., is that Wendy said the early mode modular in her mind could only do several different sounds. So to keep things interesting, she would rapidly change between different patches. A technique called hocketing. So I have a module that allows me to do that while I'm playing.
Cool.
Logic, because quite often I need to combine signals together, combine a trigger with this, with a different trigger pattern from this. So I have all sorts of very, left brain logic modules, AND gates, OR gates, etc., all in this section for when I need to do some trickery with my gates and recombining clocks and recombining triggers. So that's the input section that generates notes and sweeps up to the section. Down here is the output section. These are most of my effects. A qubit data bender, which I just got that I want to play with. I'm very much into the groove because I'm a bass player and I like percussion. It can be synchronized to a clock, so that's important to me, including doing changes in its processing based on clock pulses. That matches the way I think. You mentioned the clouds module that you saw in an earlier photo. That's now been replaced in this case by a Instro R-bar, which is a more advanced granular module. And this is very fun, very high fidelity module. Clouds was a lot of fun. I still have a monsoon in one of the boxes down here, but it had low fidelity and did not have a lot of memory. This is very high fidelity, more memory in it, so I can start with a high quality signal and then degrade it if I want more of a cassette tape sort of sound out of it, which is all you can get out of things like clouds. And I had the updated clouds beads over in my performance system, which is across the room.
Got it.
So I've got that. I have my delay line, my 3-module delay patch. I could not find a delay that did what I want, because we were talking about tape delays earlier. I like the way that repeats of the tape delay each sound different as the frequency range starts to deteriorate with each repeat of those echoes. I wanted a controlled way of doing that in my modular system. So I ended up putting together a 4MS DLD dual looping delay, lots of memory, very clean sound. It allows me to precisely choose how many clock divisions each delay is, so I can set up all these different polyrhythms and different patterns that I like. But then I have through that a stereo mixer, in this case a higher low from Knob Farm out of Croatia, out of the Ukraine, by the way. Please support them. They're difficult times right now, but they make fantastic modules. And in between is the stereo mixer. In this case, it's a Katowice from Chaos Devices. So every repeat of my delay, I have a mini 3-band EQ down here where I can change what that character is on every repeat. I have kind of a philosophy about my effects that effects should be their own instruments. I don't think that effects should be a replication of the original sound. I want my effects to be counterpoints to the sound that I fed into them. So that's why I like to have things like filtering, transposition, other tricks, so that the echo that comes back or the reverb that comes back is different in character than the dry sound, so that those are playing against each other rather than just one adding to the other one. That's another kind of personal philosophy thing. Effects Aid HL. I have 3 Effects Aids, by the way, from Happy Nerd. A lot of the multi-effects digital processors, particularly in Eurorack, use this chip called the spin chip. I don't think it's a particularly good DSP chip, to be honest. I've heard a lot of mediocre sounds from it, but Igor at Happy Nerding has gotten sounds out of a spin chip that I think rival some of the best rack devices and pedals. So that's why I have 3 of them, because that replaces having racks full of reverbs. I can have them as modules in this case, because he's programmed them really well inside the Effects Aid. And then I have input-output section. I have stereo mixers down here. I particularly like the Frapp Tools CGM system, channel group master. So I have a whole setup of their system with 3 subgroup outputs. I can have 3 stereo submixes going off to my computer, various stereo imaging devices. I have the Minsk from Chaos Devices. Missing right here is I also have a stereo strip module from DivKit, which is made by Bafaco. That's all having some work done on it right now, but a stereo module with voltage controlled panning, very musical sounding 3-band EQ, another great addition to the system. lots of mixers, output modules and mixers. I have other random output modules here. So again, this is part of my philosophy. The CGM system from Frap Tools is super clean. Exact copy of what comes. I have a non-farm OOTS module, which is their joke on outputs, multiple outputs. It's an OOTS that has control over how much harmonic distortion and what type of harmonic distortion you're adding to the sound. So if I want to purposely make a sound warmer or dirtier, I can use the OOTS module. Down here, I have a main key please exist, which is just a bunch of transformer outputs. Transformers have their own sound. They roll off the high end a little bit. They have a kind of a warmer, fattened bass sound. So again, for a bass patch where I may want it to fatten out a little bit, I might run it through the warm transformer module rather than the super clean CGM module. So even my mixers are chosen based on the different sound characteristics that they have.
I do have a question from Gary.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
And he wanted to know where you learn about the new modules. Where do you get the information so that you know which ones you want to acquire? Where do you typically go to?
Oh, I hang out on Facebook like most other people. There's several good modular groups on Facebook. There's several people that I particularly trust. The one person who I really go to a lot is Ben Wilson, who goes by the name of DivKid. He has a lot of very educational module videos on YouTube. Ben has studied music. He's gone to school in music. He teaches music, but he's also into modulars. So he brings a very informed musical approach to his module videos, as opposed to just let's turn this knob and see what it does. He's very much into what's the musical use for this. So DivKid's module videos are the first ones that I watch. And then, reading Facebook groups, talking to other musicians to see what they find interesting. I belong to a couple different groups and sit in on their Zoom meetings or in-person meetings to see what modules people think are hot. And then I'll buy stuff and try it. I'm not afraid to buy something, not like it, and have to turn around and sell it.
Gary
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Gary has a part 2 to his question. How often do you patch your portable system into your larger system to do things you couldn't do with either alone?
So far, I have not patched one into the other. They've had very divided tasks. And that's because the portable system was originally supposed to be just when I'm a drummer playing behind other people. And this was supposed to be just my playground, my sandbox where I could play around with new sounds and new techniques. And that was the division of labor in between them. One was for playing music, one was for experimenting with sound. Then COVID hit, and I couldn't go out and play with other musicians anymore. And I got invited by the Colorado Modular Synthesis Society to be part of a show they did called October Skies. Everyone does 20-minute space music piece. I'm like, oh, well, this is a good time to actually make music with this, rather than just experiment and make sounds with it. So I transitioned to doing all my music on the Monster, along with my other keyboard synthesizers, for a couple of years. Then when COVID started to let up a little bit, and we started getting the possibility of going out and playing music again, I was like, how can I recreate this in something I can carry on to an airplane? So the small system is basically me distilling these concepts down into something that fits into the overhead bin of an airplane.
Gotcha.
So it's its own system. It has its own vector sequencer. It duplicates a lot of the modules that are in here, but it also has a lot of percussion-focused sounds. Now, I'm working on a piece right now that's supposed to be all modular. I'm not allowed to use my other keyboards and my virtual instruments. So I might use both of them for that piece, because I have my system in my studio set up with 56 audio inputs, actually. So I have 16 inputs from this, actually 16, 20, 22 inputs from this case alone that I can break out and send separately to my digital audio workstation.
Well, there you go.
I have a pair of Praxis snake charmers. Those are my outputs that go into these +4 balanced snakes. I had rewired my system just before I broke my leg last year, and I'm just now getting back to using this system I put together a year ago. And Eurorack and Modular have a reputation for being noisy, etc. I was looking at these yesterday, and I put them up on a spectrum analyzer.
Mm.
The loudest noise was at minus 108 dB, and the quietest frequency band is at minus 142 dB out of the system. So it is possible to build a very quiet studio quality modular system, but I spent thousands of dollars on the power supply for the system to be able to get there. But I have this. They're all MIDI together to the computer, as well as the performance system, which is across the room. They might not be cross-patched, but they might end up playing a duet this month. We'll see what happens.
I'd like to play that video clip that you sent me as the last item to this live stream. We're reaching 2 hours, and I'm quite sure
Wow, we done already?
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. So let me play the clip. This is a clip of a recent performance, and Chris wanted us to watch this clip because he had the enjoyment of using an ATV A-frame E-drum, but the way he's used it is quite novel. So let me play the clip, and Chris, you could do a little spiel after to end the live stream. So I'll play it now, everyone. So I'll just play I'll just play a few seconds, maybe a couple of minutes of it. Hold on, the movie doesn't seem to be loading. Let me do it again. Hold on, hold your horses. Here we go. Wish me luck. For some reason it's not running. Let me try it one last time. That's bizarre.
I emailed you the URL for people to see this as an unlisted movie on YouTube. Maybe you could post the URL in the chat so that people can see it at their own leisure later on, and I can explain a little bit ahead of time what they'll be hearing.
Did you send me the URL via Facebook, or it was
It was in the email.
Alright, so I have to run up my... Let me just try this one last time before we give it up.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure why it's doing this. Sorry everyone, I'm not quite sure why it's not playing, but I'll give you the URL and just hold on for a few seconds so that you can watch it in your own time.
I can also explain the concept of what was going on because it kind of expands out to how I had to put together a new performance system. I used to travel with just the modular, and the mixer and the audio outputs and everything were inside the modular. Because I was just the drummer, I didn't have to worry about playing all these other instrument parts. But then when I started having to play, well, not having to play, wanting to play complex solo pieces with just what I could take on an airplane, I went to what's called a hybrid system, where I'm now using a laptop alongside the modular. All my mixing happens in the laptop, for example, inside Ableton Live. and some virtual instruments and some plug-in effects like Valhalla, Shimmer, etc., are inside the laptop. But because I have the two systems interconnected, the laptop and the modular, I really allow them to talk to each other. So not only does the modular send a lot of signals to the laptop has effects sends that can send back to the modular. So some of the effects I have in the modular, like the Starlab Strymon systems, another version of my 3-module effects chain, beads for granular synthesis, stereo filters, etc. Basically, if there's an effect I want to perform live, it's in the modular, and I'll actually have the computer loop the audio through the modular and back to the computer again. So this particular video, when people have a chance to see it, I brought out an electronic frame drum called the A-frame from a company called ATV. It was Takahashi's company after he left Roland. His son is a great percussionist, and they made this sound modeling based frame drum for him. But what I did with this, I turned off all the effects in the frame drum itself, and then had the signal go through the laptop into the modular and processed it with all sorts of reverbs and echoes and granular effects. So even these simple taps and scratches I was doing then blossomed out into all these different repeats and variations on the sound. So I could do relatively few gestures and go play another instrument at the same time.
Chris, I'm going to try and play it off YouTube. So okay. I'm going to give it a shot right now. Everyone let me know if you can hear it.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with that one. And that was me trying to find a synergy between the instruments and the modular. For example, the A-frame does have reverb built in, but I was having a lot of fun putting it through the Starlab module in the modular case because, among other things, the Starlab has control voltage for the transposition for its shimmer effect, transposing up and down. So what I did was, rather than just choose like 7 semitones or 12 semitones or whatever, I took another module that does a slowly random voltage smoothly and patched that into the pitch transpose. So while I'm playing sounds, you hear there's only they'll transpose down in pitch, the reverb. Then the reverb will transpose up in pitch. Because that's something I can't easily do with a plugin on the laptop, let alone mouse over to it and adjust it. but I can do that in my modular easily. So that's kind of a hybrid system of, let me take one sound source, process it through the modular, playing to the strings of the modular system, to create what I hope is a different sound or a new sound. I think that performance also shows what an electronic musician has to do in terms of splitting their brain, like, I'm playing music while I'm also turning controls and setting up the next section of music and changing all the things on the hold and push while also trying to play. Yeah, it's quite a juggling act to play solo electronic music.
Are you still there? I lost your voice.
There. Do you still have my voice, or is it gone?
Somehow or other, I've lost your audio.
No.
That's a clue, and we should stop. Let me see. I can't.
I'm
I
just
still
checking
can't
my
hear
microphone.
Chris.
My microphone works.
Everyone, I need a clue from the viewing audience. Can you hear Chris? Is it just my side?
Can you hear me speaking, or
Breaking
I see
up. Yeah, it's breaking up here to a point where I can't hear him anymore. But Gary, can you hear Chris at all? Talking to Gary Mayulo.
Hopefully, yeah.
Chris's audio
must have
breaking
fallen
up.
out of
Yeah.
sync with Skype.
Yeah.
Do you want to try? Connect?
And it's not allowing me to. Let me see. Chris. I'm gonna hang up the call and call you again to end the live stream. Okay. Everyone's gonna hang up on Chris. I'm gonna call him again. Hopefully, we will be more fortunate this time. So let's give it a few seconds and then wish me luck.
Fingers crossed that you can hear me now.
Chris, you're back and I can hear you. Yes, it was Skype.
Good.
Skype always does the dirty on us.
Yeah, it was. I was muting Skype so you wouldn't hear me slurping water. I shouldn't have done that.
Oh, so it was your fault.
Yeah, we'll blame me on this one. So what I was trying to say were two things. Is one, that I was taking advantage of what I could do with my modular that I can't easily do with a plugin or even a pedal, such as pitch bending the reverb using a slow random modulator inside the modular case, using the beads granular module to play fragments of the sound backwards and transposed up an octave.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah.
So that's the synergy of using other instruments with my modular to process them in addition to creating original sounds. But I also think that video clip kind of shows how an electronic musician either has to have a lot of backing tracks, or they have to split their brain in two while playing, of like, I'm trying to play a drum and I'm trying to set up the push, do all these different things because I was launching arpeggio, launching a sound effect, switching over to the vocal sound, then switching to a virtual instrument to play that sound while also trying to play over here and trying to mix. Yeah, it's quite a tap dance to play live.
Musicians are definitely well known for being good multitaskers, I would say.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate your time and your effort and for putting up with all the technical hitches I call the tech gremlins. Everyone, you've been great viewers. I haven't had as many questions as I thought I would have, but I'm glad I was armed with several, at least the ones that interested me anyway. Chris, we might have to have you back again in the future because there's so much to talk about. We could probably spend the whole night just chatting.
Well, I'm going to keep busy. I just came off a very busy performance schedule this year, and I'm looking forward to transitioning now. I have on my hard drives close to 4 albums of material that's waiting for me to edit and mix and get them mastered and get them out. So hopefully next time maybe I'll have some new albums and we can talk about those.
Yeah. That would be nice. Again, thanks, Chris, so very much. Here's our Oh, our virtual applause is not working now. Ha ha
And
ha.
I would just share, if you're interested in this stuff, I do run a Patreon channel, the Learning Modular channel over on Patreon, where I break down every single track I do, and every time I change modules, I explain why I've changed the modules. Someone was asking earlier, how do I go about that process?
Yes.
I'm on version 27 of this now on Modular Grid, for example.
Yes,
So
Chris,
if you want to see that process, that's the reason I have a Patreon channel, is to share with you, every week what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
Chris does, and in our round 1, I did say please support Chris's Patreon, and he has a website, Learning Modular, as well. He also has a Bandcamp site under Alias Zone, so please support Chris and his efforts. His Learning Modular material is for anyone who is interested, so a chunk of it is free. There's a chunk of it that's subscription based. You get a lot of value, as you know already. That's why you're here, from what he does. So please support him with all your effort and all your might. So again, thanks, Chris. Sorry, I was reading the live chat and I saw you appear.
Yeah, I'm typing into the live chat too. Like, what's he looking at? Oh, he's looking at the chat dialogue.
No,
Sorry.
I got distracted and I slipped. Yes, I'm still on the live stream. 5.
Yes, it's been over 2 hours, we know. Thank you, everyone, for coming out again.
I'm sorry, that was my mom. She just knocked on the door to see if I was ready for lunch. Well, the family usually goes out for lunch on a Sunday, so.
I hope you have a great time. I hope you don't get too wet with the rain out there.
I hope so too. But again, I really appreciate you, Chris, and please stay in touch. Let us know what you're up to. And so here's my usual spiel at the end. We totally and utterly enjoyed having you on the live stream, and I hope you had fun too. And I've already mentioned to the viewing audience where you can find Chris's work if you want tips and tricks on how to get on to a modular system if you have not already, or if you are in the throes of but you have concerns about this or that. Please go on to his website, Learning Modular, and also support his Patreon. Chris, we wish you exciting projects ahead, and let us know when you've released your album, or let me know anyway what you're up to, because we could always feature whatever project it is you're working on at that moment as well, or just chat. So I cannot seem to run the applause soundbite, so I will do the real world version. And to our viewers, you've been wonderful. Please subscribe if you haven't already to my channel, and like this video or any other videos that you see. I would really appreciate that. My own music is also on Bandcamp, just like Chris's, except that it's under my name. If you would like to hear more of what I do or want to support me. And I'll see you on the next program with your friends. Bring them too. Thank you,
Thanks,
y'all.
everyone.
Thanks, and I'll see you then. Thanks, Chris.
My pleasure.